So I've chosen the title tonight, Enabling Micromobility's Full Potential Through Good Regulation, because I feel that that's the common goal we're all thriving towards from a regulatory perspective, a policy and a public sector perspective, but also from the user and from an operator's perspective. And that's actually what I want to look at today. So starting first of all from the user's perspective, then looking at the key objectives from the operator's perspective, leading to the public perspective, and then finally aligning all these objectives, and finally to conclude with a couple of recommendations to achieve good regulations. So a couple of words about us. So Dott is a European micromobility operator currently active in 16 cities with 30,000 live scooters every day. And we're also going to start e-bikes very soon. Now looking at the user's perspective, Kaspar, setz dich bitte zurück. Sorry. We have on the one hand side, we see the main drivers to use our services, and based on some internal user research we've conducted across all our markets, or across the main markets in Europe. This is not surprising, of course, no? So this is just re-emphasizing what we know already. So users really value the efficiency, the time saving, especially for short and medium trips, mainly driven by this free-floating experience in the first place. This also aligns with the availability of mobility service 24/7, even during times where public transport might be a little bit reduced in service, and also the availability in terms of a short walking distance to the nearest scooter or to the final destination. And here we see, I brought a comparison of two data points, one based on a survey, 60, Marion's on the call here, thanks for your great work there, what they've done in 2019 to evaluate the willingness of e-scooter users to walk. And thanks to Niels and his team from Oslo, just bringing this in comparison, that there's a very similar trend. Users, or the willingness to walk for users is rapidly, drastically decreasing over time. So the majority of people, they prefer to just walk 1 to 2 minutes to the nearest scooter or the final destination. The third aspect, which is very important for users, is the pleasure, the fun factor, and especially also for younger cohorts, the sustainability aspect. It doesn't seem to be that much of a role for older users, but especially for the younger cohorts it does. And for them it's also an aspect of belonging to an innovative and modern community. On the other hand, there are also several barriers to use micromobility services. So one aspect which was mentioned quite significantly was the perceived high price. So a typical cost of a e-scooter is around about 250 to 350, and this basically is the full mobility cost. It is not subsidized. It includes all the costs, including the depreciation of the hardware, including the service operations, all the company overhead, etc. So that's actually what this short trip, 10-15 minutes, costs. And sorry. Okay. The second barrier to use is if there's a limited service area or accessibility. So micromobility services, they tend to focus first of all on urban centers where there's a minimum density to create the network effects and the synergies in their operations. We're also excluding or tend to exclude areas in the periphery where you don't really have this kind of density, or where you might have a very high level of social demographically difficult situation. Then the third aspect as a barrier to use is the feeling of unsafeness. So especially driven by lack of dedicated cycling infrastructure, speed differences with cars and with the moving traffic when users have to ride on the roads, and also by riding on purely maintained roads. Looking at the operator's perspective, we obviously, in order to make money, we are dependent on the revenues from the users. So we have to focus on those users, on those cohorts in the society, which actually use our services. No? And I have to admit, there is a bias towards the younger generation. There's also a bias towards a more male usage. So there's quite a gap, a gender gap here we see. Of course, we do measures in terms of tailored messaging to expand and get a more variety of user profiles. And some of the very current user service we're doing right now already tends to indicate that we are able to close the gender gap, but it's a bit too early to already talk about real figures here. So I have to rely on some of the figures we've done in our last year's user survey. What's striking here is that the majority of micromobility users do not own a car. So that means there's also, when we're always talking about mode shift potential, it's not always about that, but it's also about not even letting younger people consider buying a car in the future. So second, on the cost drivers of the service, we are cautious about low density service areas, especially if it's caused by fragmented governance or heavy policy restrictions. There are some examples in the past where the regulatory framework just simply didn't work because the market was super fragmented and also needed to include areas which did not really make operational sense. Also a concern for us is if we need to operate on artificially low scale. So if we're not able to address the full demand, but we are constrained in our deployment with a too low number, because that also reduces then the availability for users. Given that the average walking distance is getting longer, and that means a less attractive service and different user choices. It also prevents operational scale economies. So, and the third cost driver is if for example, through these measures or through these characteristics, there's a low user uptake, which can also be driven by the barriers to use, like feeling unsafe, high price, etc. So looking at the public perspective, and there are obviously a lot of experts here who have contributed to the knowledge about this and to who are driving this topic further. So, but I'm just picking out a couple of themes which appear again and again all over in the discussions I have with policymakers. So of course, it's safety for all. No? And here differentiated between users and non-users. So I think for users, it's fair to say that the industry has matured over time. I mean, when we compare the first generation hardware on 2017-18, which was basically not fit for purpose and an off-the-shelf toy for kids deployed on the streets, that there were a lot of safety concerns just imminent from the hardware. But I think nowadays the hardware out there is produced to be shared. It's produced to comply with all regulatory safety requirements, and often even exceeding it. And also the industry has doubled down to provide the best possible rider education. And for the non-users though, there's obviously a concern, and in several cities it's still not solved to a very satisfactory level, that street clutter or badly parked vehicles, they are blocking the road, the walk-through on the sidewalks. They are a safety hazard for blind and visual impaired people. And also sidewalk riding is an issue which is mainly driven by lack of cycling infrastructure, but it obviously affects the ability to walk as a pedestrian on the sidewalks. And it's clear sidewalks needs to be sanctuaries for pedestrians. The second key objective obviously is social inclusion. We want to make sure that the service is affordable for all. If we want to become a public transport kind of solution, not just for the rich and sexy, but also for everyone, we need to provide tariffs and access points for low-income user groups, and also serving the underserved areas, especially for the first mile outside of the core city. But that comes in the end at a cost. The third key objective from a public perspective, the sustainability piece. So looking at it, and we discussed a lot over the past 2 days with some great contribution from Anne and with her study on full life cycle considerations. We need to look very closely at the batteries and how we extend the lifetime and think about useful second life measures here. This includes also zero emission operations, but also on the social side, a no gig economy operations. So how can we align these objectives? And I think, yes, we can, because even when we're coming from different perspectives, there are solutions which are able to address all of them and bring them together. So if we're picking the one or the other out here now, so for example, if the user is looking for a maximum availability and reliability of the service, and the operator, he needs to avoid low scale operations. But on the other hand, the public wants to avoid street clutter. So a solution, for example, could be to agree on a demand-oriented fleet size, not just an arbitrarily number put with a finger in the air. And then also considering the possibly growing demand in the future with these services growing more mature, and implementing a dynamic fleet cap and a cap of operators, because that will help then also those operators in the city to offer the best possible service while keeping a minimum fleet size available to their users. So an idea, for example, how this could work is through a competitive tender. Similarly, if you are looking at the objective of efficiency and time saving, so a near door-to-door, near free float user experience, obviously we as an operator, we want to provide this user experience and for all our market segments to maximize the revenue. But on the other hand, the public sector needs to have an orderly and tidy streetscapes to mitigate risks to pedestrians and other vulnerable road users. So here, parking in dedicated spots with a very dense network, exclusively used for micromobility, not for cars and other modes of transport, and making it mandatory to park there, can be a good solution to align those objectives. And we can run through those points here one by one. It might exceed the time here a little bit I have for this presentation, but we're sharing the deck anyhow with you, so we can take the discussion. Right, so going into some selected recommendations to achieve good regulations. First of all, we can think about how to avoid clutter through an optimal fleet size model. We can also look at how to achieve the highest parking compliance supported by infrastructure and technology, how to plan for greater urban areas so that we are not just focusing on the core city, but also taking involving the local authorities within the metropolitan area. And finally, also looking at sustainability. So we have taken an initiative over the past couple of weeks and months to think about what could be the optimal fleet size model for any city. And we've based this on historical data. We've based this on, first of all, the total population of the city, looking at the core city, but also the remaining metropolitan area. We were also looking at the annual tourist inflow and the time each of those segments are spending in the city to then derive to an addressable population. So within the suitable age categories, also looking then at the historical demand over time. So there's obviously different uptake in cities like Oslo or Paris, which are really high in user volumes versus some other cities. And that obviously drives then the optimal fleet size to then finally come to a conclusion about a suggested citywide cap. So just to give you a snapshot of our findings, and we were looking at some of the mature European regulated cities like Lyon, like Paris, like Milano, like Rome, and were deriving the suggested fleet size for some of the markets where currently a regulatory process or the regulations is in progress, and where basically our counterparts in the city tell us, well, what should be the right size of a fleet. So if we're running our model for the existing markets here, in most of the markets, most of the cities, we are actually coming pretty close to the current real fleet size, or the cap here, with the exception of Rome, where the currently the fleet size and also the number of operators seems to be more towards the higher side. But there's also a public debate at the moment around a high amount of clutter and a way how to reduce it. So yeah, just as an example, for a city like Dublin, with around about 2.5 million population in the greater Dublin area, something around 5,500 vehicles could be a good starting point. Then, of course, with the asterisk that if the demand is growing, is showing very high numbers, that this could obviously then trigger the model for a dynamic cap, which can be exceeded in the future. On the second topic, on infrastructure and technology, I need to say I have to applaud Natalia and the team in Paris for their great work over the past 2 years in creating a data-driven model or a data-driven network of a very, very high dense parking network. And so with these 2,500 parking hubs across 81 kilometers, we have on average, not more than 100 meters to walk to the nearest hub, which means 1.5 minutes walking. So that's completely aligned with the user perspective and their objectives to not walk further than 2 minutes. Also, yeah, the way it has been pushed into the into several districts and making it consistent across the whole service geo or across the whole city is really useful for the user, because they are not confused by different designs and different user experiences within certain areas of the city. But yeah, they know what to expect, and through the visual markings on the street through some signposts, it's also visual where to park, even though you're not putting your eyes in the smartphone all the time. This needs to be encompassed also with the right technology. So making it, creating all these parking bays, but then just making it optional to park there and maybe incentivizing it doesn't really deliver good results. And also from the study from Oslo, from the Norwegian Institute of Transport Economics, we know that only 60 to 65% actually park in or nearby those parking spots, but the rest, they are still parking them somewhere where they find it useful. And making it mandatory through the right enforcement technology is really key for a high level of parking compliance. And that's the result. So we have classified it on our colleagues from 6T and Momentum in their great study. They have classified the 3 periods in Paris. So there was in spring 2019, there was an initial confusion where everybody was parking wherever, because of a lack of regulation, a lack of infrastructure, and a lack of guidance. So 35% of the users who were asked whether they thought they were parking correctly said, actually, yes, we parked, we didn't park on the footway, but we parked somewhere in dedicated or in spots, in parking spots. In a similar study or user survey in autumn 2019, this has already increased to 71%. And when looking at our data in 2020 to see how many trips have been ended outside of the dedicated spot, so within the GPS fence, and also so they incurred a fine of 10 euro. So this was basically only 3%. So 97% of all our users have parked correctly. Oh, sorry. And so we've taken those learnings and insights also to provide advice and recommendations to tailor to London. So one of the greater urban metropolitan areas in the world, where you have 33 different authorities, all the different boroughs. In the past, there has been quite a fragmentation in terms of micromobility regulations. So on the bike side, you needed to talk to every single borough, and some of them, they had dedicated parking spots. Others, they were happy to have a free floating operations. Others, they were forcing us into a hybrid solution, and each one of them, they had different ways how to signpost, how to visualize the parking, and inform the user about it. So that's not really user-friendly, and it's not really good for the operators, because it's really difficult for us to then manage that. So we have taken, with the knowledge from Paris, we transferred to London. We have given them some recommendations on key planning principles, essentially also taking into account the user perspective and the maximum walking distance to the nearest bay. Also then recommending on a governance structure, which is a neutral body, which includes the key stakeholders, including TfL, the local boroughs, the operators, but also other key stakeholders, in order to create a consistent design, consistent planning principles across all local authorities, to provide dedicated funding to implement this and to constantly monitor the performance. Last but not least, on sustainability, Dott, together with the colleagues from TIER and from BOY, have made a voluntary commitment and a pledge in July 2020 across the full life cycle of our operations, including manufacturing, including operations, including end of life, and also throughout the life cycle, being very transparent and calculate the carbon emissions and those who are still incurring, mainly from production, to offset them to be 100% carbon neutral. And if policymakers are thinking about how to regulate or how to make sure that the carbon footprint and the social impact of micromobility services is maximized, then this could be a starting point for this. Of course, we can go way, way deeper into this, but in many conversations with, especially with smaller and mid-sized cities, we always see that they start from a blank page, and there is something already happening, and we just need to make it known. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions and start the debate. Thank you.